Thank you very much for joining us for this episode of the program. I'm delighted to be here with the MirYam Institute in-house analyst, Yaakov Lapin, for this episode of our Israel briefing. And Yaakov, we've got a lot to talk about. I've actually edited some of the subjects that we're going to touch upon for reasons that I'll explain in just a few moments. But first of all, as ever, I ask, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Benjamin. I'm talking to you from my new office, which I'm enjoying the new facilities. And, you know, the obstacles of working from home are becoming very apparent for me once that environment changes a little bit. So, yeah, personally doing very well.
So you're an amazing fellow because your new office looks exactly like your old office.
That's thanks to this wonderful Zoom background that I'm using. But I can assure you that behind that background, things look very different. And it's not that I didn't enjoy working from home, because that also has its perks. But creating this sort of lab-like, ability to put the world on silent for an X number of hours and to focus exclusively on work has tremendous benefits for concentration. So it's definitely a move that I'm happy with at this stage.
I'm very pleased. I'm glad that you went on and got the office. I know it was something that we discussed from time to time, and I wish you every success there. I hope you go from strength to strength there. And I'm very pleased to be one of probably the first activities that you've undertaken in that office, because we're here to discuss some hot button issues. And for anybody who isn't aware of it, this conversation is roughly supposed to be based upon your monthly wrap-up that you submit to the MirYam Institute, and people can read your most recent monthly wrap-up on our website at miryaminstitute.org. But I'm going to deviate from the script, which is something that I'm sure you'll be shocked by, because you identified three topics. So the three topics we were going to speak about was the potential constitutional crisis that's brewing with regard to the law that was enacted, the law that was put forward and is being reviewed by an unprecedented 15 justice deep panel of Supreme Court justices next month. And the outcome of their deliberations may trigger or may avert a constitutional crisis. And it's a very important topic. The reason I'm not going to touch upon it, Yaakov, is twofold. First of all, we just don't know, right? We'd be guilty of supposition in the extreme, I think, if we were to deal in what the outcomes may be of a conversation that hasn't yet begun. But the second reason that I'm going to move past it, Yaakov, is because we're again in the midst of a really tragic series of events here in Israel. This morning, Batsheva Nigri, an Israeli woman in her 40s, was shot dead. A man who was with her, I believe this individual had granted her a lift after she was hitchhiking. He was seriously wounded in this terror attack that took place very close to the city of Hebron. The pair who have been assailed, one of whom, as I say, has been killed, the other of whom has been severely injured, were both in their 40s. And they came under fire, Yaakov, from a passing vehicle while driving on Route 60, the highway that's close to Bet Haggai junction. Yes, and this junction is south of Hebron. And the Magen David Adom ambulance service said that the woman, who was initially listed in critical condition when they arrived at the scene, was later declared dead at that same scene shortly thereafter. And you mentioned her 6-year-old daughter. Of course, that's awful in and of itself, but Batsheva Nigri was the mother of 3, including the 6-year-old who was in the car at the time of this terror attack. And that daughter has emerged unscathed, of course, physically only. She will know the rest of her days without her mother. But despite that, one has to see something of the miraculous nature in the survival of the daughter, because the car was hit, according to reports, by 22 rounds, 22 bullets that were fired by the terrorist or terrorists who committed this act. And 2 days prior to that, a Palestinian terrorist killed 2 Israeli men, Shai Silas Nigreka, who was 60 years of age, and his 28-year-old son, Aviad Nir, This was a father and a son, as I've just alluded to, who were killed while they were having their car washed in the town of Hawara, a town that's been in the news for all of the wrong reasons of late. So Yaakov, sorry that we have to dive into this. I wish that the circumstances weren't as they are, but aside from the horrific nature of these crimes and the strength, comfort, and of course condolences that we send to the family and the loved ones of those who have been murdered, tell us what you think we're looking at here.
We're looking at a prolonged escalation, and the word escalation may not be sufficient to describe what's happening in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, because an escalation tends to mean that it's limited in time. But this situation has been going on for almost 2 years, and it's getting worse. If we look at the figures, I've been looking at the figures over the past couple of days, and if you look at the number of shooting attacks, just that figure in the West Bank, so for the whole of 2022, which itself was a year of escalation, that figure stood at 280 shooting attacks. And now we're in the middle of 2023, and we're already passing the 200 mark quite soon in terms of number of shooting attacks. So we're going to be having more shootings in the first half of this year than we had in almost all of 2022. In terms of number of casualties of terrorism, in 2022, we were looking at 31 casualties, and this year we are already past that at 34 casualties, including this latest attack. So more casualties of terrorism in the first half of this year than in all of 2022. And 2022 itself was a major escalation of these figures compared to the previous year. So this is a period of prolonged escalation. I wouldn't call it an intifada because it's not at that scale yet, but it is something that is beyond any sort of limited escalation that we have seen since the second intifada. Since the second intifada ended at approximately 2005, we are seeing a situation in which approximately 2 years of escalated shootings, terror attacks, attempted bombings, more intensified IDF operations. All of these things are happening, and there's no sign of them slowing down. So there's no sort of off-ramp that we could point to in the near future that would suggest that, this is what's going to calm the situation down. In terms of what the IDF is doing, I think, first of all, to point out that for every one of these attacks, there's something like 10 that are foiled. And that just gives us a scope of, the real extent of the threat here. It's more than 500 terror attacks that are foiled by the IDF and the Shin Bet intelligence agency every year. And so we're seeing the very tragic and painful tip of the iceberg, and underneath the water is a much larger threat that is foiled. And the IDF currently has, more than 20 battalions now mobilized. They just sent another battalion into the West Bank. And, every battalion like this that gets sent in is not training for war against Hezbollah. It's not preparing for other arenas. So this is eroding war readiness on other fronts. And essentially what we're seeing is an ongoing escalation that began at the beginning of 2022 and getting worse this year. And the Israeli Defense Establishment is trying its hardest to contain it. It's under strain. And, it's going to be facing questions from the Israeli public about whether more of the same is going to be enough, or whether significantly more stringent activities will be necessary to bring the situation under control.
And of course, those who are responsible for the perpetration of these terrorist activities are the terrorists themselves. It's not the Israeli government. It's not those innocents who were driving through Judea and Samaria. It's the terrorists themselves. But I wonder if you can comment on how this looks, given this increasing number of shooting attacks, how this looks when matched up against the rhetoric of ministers such as Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is currently the Minister for National Security, formerly known as the Ministry of Internal Security. He's the Minister for National Security, and the rhetoric of Minister Bezalel Smotrich. The idea being that with these two in situ, the situation would be brought very swiftly to order. Doesn't stack up very well, does it, their rhetoric against the reality?
Look, terrorism is a thorn that has plagued the state of Israel since its very founding, since the first days of its founding to this day. So the idea that there's any, silver bullet that can eliminate the problem has always been a fantasy. And it's Defense Minister Gallant who is in charge of the policy, together in coordination with Prime Minister Netanyahu, for what Israel does in the West Bank. He has primary responsibility for the policies that are being enacted. And the Security Cabinet, which doesn't meet very often, includes the ministers that you've just mentioned. But, at the end of the day, I don't buy into the idea that any one government is either responsible for or in a superior position to solve this issue that we call Palestinian terrorism, because it is a complex and deep-rooted problem. And what's happening now, again, began in 2022 under the former government, okay, and the escalation began under the former government. It's getting worse under this government. And it is an independent phenomena. It's not linked to which government is in power. Of course, the policies that governments promote can make the situation better or worse, but the driving force of Palestinian terrorism is completely independent from the identity of the government in power. It's driven by incitement or intention, and it's driven by capabilities or the ability to make good on those intentions. And in the case of the West Bank, the reason that we have seen this spike, the primary reason that I would point to is the availability of firearms. The fact that guns are so easily available in the West Bank in a way that they have not been in previous years is the primary reason, I think, that we're seeing this spike in terrorism. Guns are pouring into the West Bank, whether it's from Jordan, whether it's from West Bank workshops where they're locally produced, and also from Israel itself, I'm sorry to say, where they're stolen from IDF bases, primarily in southern Israel. The IDF is making lots of efforts to limit that. But you have these sort of three sources of guns, and they're flooding the West Bank with firearms. And that means that any Palestinian who's determined enough can get hold of a semi-automatic rifle and launch these attacks. Now, if you add to that the fact that Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Iran are all pouring funds and incitement and encouragement for these localized terror factions to operate, then you have all of the ingredients for this storm that we're currently witnessing. And it's a challenge that any government here is going to have to face and deal with, whatever their ideology is and whatever their politics are.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on what you mentioned very, very briefly there, which is that this uptick in terror seems to bring about a downturn in training for war fighting when it comes to the soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces. The Israel Defense Forces West Bank Division has 13 battalions to its name, and over the past 18 months, that number has fluctuated because of this rise in Palestinian terror attacks, the high point numerically of which was 26 battalions in October 2022 that were stationed in the area. And following this most recent deployment that you spoke about, Monday's deployment, there will be 23 battalions in the West Bank. So even higher than the number 20, which I think you quoted, or you said more than 20. It's actually 23 battalions are going to be in the West Bank or
Right.
Judea and Samaria. And the work, here's what I want to say about this, Yaakov. The work of most battalions in Judea and Samaria is something akin to police work. Most of them. Now, that is not the case for all by any means, and police work is not a full and fair and correct and accurate description of the activities of the soldiers who are stationed in those areas. But the work they undertake, let me tell you this, is very far indeed from the war fighting for which the Israel Defense Forces actually exists and for which it was founded. Now, the West Bank Division, with these 13 battalions under its command, when it goes from 13 battalions to 23 battalions, that means that something is very, very off. And doing so, to speak this out to our listeners, doing so, namely making this leap from 13 battalions to 23, it leaves a significant gap in our wartime readiness, not just the training. And wartime readiness is actually something for which the Israel Defense Forces is repeatedly pilloried whenever a major operational war is followed by a domestic Israeli investigation into the operational prosecution of those wars. You're familiar with these internal investigations that take place and are then publicized and chewed over and and nitpicked at by commentators in the Israeli news, in online broadcasts, in written broadcasts, and of course in old-fashioned television broadcasts. And the thing that I want to say about this is as follows. Look, Yaakov, Israelis and anyone who cares about Israelis are constantly defining the Iranian nuclear threat as the highest order strategic threat to the state of Israel. And I think they're wrong. I think that Iran constitutes the highest order strategic threat shared by, for example, the current and future signatories to the Abraham Accords, which is the next subject we're going to get into. But Israel's highest order strategic threat, in my opinion, is this one. It is what we intend to do about the Palestinian-Arab conflict against Israel. And current events also underscore why making such a woeful miscalculation of policy priorities by this Israeli government, specifically around front-loading judicial reform, is so completely unforgivable. And it further shows the grave danger of IDF reservists declaring their unwillingness to take a different side of the coin of the errors spinning out of the judicial reform or overhaul debate. It further shows the grave danger of IDF reservists declaring their unwillingness to serve if called upon to do so. Because let me tell you, as you know, and as I hope our listeners will understand, the reinforcements that I just listed, that leap from 13 to 23, in many cases, though not all, those reinforcements will be drawn from the reserve ranks. So we've got a major issue here. And I believe this issue is predicated on the complete lack of a clear strategy with regard to what we want to do on the front of the Palestinian-Arab conflict against Israel. What do you think about what I've just said?
You know, I think that you've raised many critical strategic points. And if I could sum them up in a nutshell, for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, I would say that they're all interlinked. And the way that I would interlink them is as follows. It's in Iran's interest and in the interest of the entire Iranian axis, which includes Hamas, PIJ, Hezbollah, all of our adversaries are essentially in one camp, even though they have differences between them, but we'll set those aside for a moment. It's in their interest to see Israel polarized. It's in their interest to see reservists alienated and refusing to come to serve. It's in their interest to see Israeli society politicize everything that happens within Israel, including security operations. This all serves Iran's interest of weakening the state of Israel, to put it simply. So anything that promotes social cohesion in Israel and reverses this polarization is going to be serving Israel's national security interest and undermining the Iranian agenda. It's as simple as that. That's the baseline theory. And everything that I would look at after that would be predicated on that perspective. So following on from what you're saying, the order of the day domestically in Israel is to return to a degree of cohesion, a minimal degree of cohesion, and to turn back the clock as much as possible, start repairing the damage and finding ways to so to speak, step off the brink, step away from the brink of this unprecedented polarization. That is a critical national security directive that Israel has to follow. And then based on that, that will improve Israel's security position in all arenas, in every single one of them. What it will not do, however, is solve this issue that we call Palestinian terrorism, because again, the prevalence of firearms, the incitement, the ideology, all of this means that this is going to be a thorn that remains in our side. And the most, unfortunately, I believe the most that we can do is to turn down the volume, turn down the flames of this problem to a manageable degree. But I don't think that we are going to be able to extinguish it in the near term or midterm future.
And just to push you to be responsive to one particular point that I made, if you're willing to be, this idea that I put out there, that actually the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a higher order strategic priority for the state of Israel than is Iran. I imagine you disagree with me, but I'd like to hear why you disagree if that's the case. And if it's not the case, I always welcome agreement, Yaakov, you know that.
Look, when it comes to prioritizing the arenas, which, essentially I think is what you're trying to do, and I think that it's a very important goal. It's an important thing to do, is to try and understand what's the most important. Like in any organization and entity, you want to know what you want to start with and what you want to prioritize, because it's very hard to do everything at the same time. And I don't think that there are any obvious right or wrong answers, because if the West Bank flares up and we have 26 divisions, and that could increase even further, then that's going to become the top priority. And the ability of the Palestinians to challenge Israel's security is absolutely something that could become a top priority overnight. We've seen that from rocket attacks in the Gaza Strip to terrorist attacks in the middle of Israeli cities, et cetera, et cetera. And also the Palestinian issue, the conflict, goes far beyond security, because we have yet to make strategic decisions about the future of the West Bank, where Israel wants to control, where it's willing to relinquish control. There's no clear policy that's been formulated on that. And that actually directly ties to other things like Israel's relations, strategic relations to the United States, to Israel's ability to normalize with Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera. So Israel's ability to manage the Palestinian conflict ties into so many other things that really it's hard to argue against the idea that the Palestinian arena is a top priority. But if you look at it from a military perspective, I would argue that the Palestinian arena is actually at the bottom end of the priorities. And the reason that I would make that argument is because no matter how much of a security threat the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are, I believe that when you look at Hezbollah and its conventional military terrorist capabilities, its ability to shut down the state of Israel with a barrage of precision missile strikes, for example, targeting state symbols like the Knesset and power plants and airports and seaports and many other strategic sites. Hezbollah uniquely has that ability that Hamas and PIJ in Gaza could only dream of. They don't come anywhere near that capability. And the West Bank terrorist atrocities that break our hearts on a regular basis, they also are unable to shut down the state of Israel as a regional power, and they can't come close to what Hezbollah could do in the event of a war. And therefore, I believe that from a military perspective, the northern arena, Hezbollah, is the top priority. And in terms of this strategic perspective, the Iranian nuclear program is indeed the top overall threat to Israel's security, because the nuclear umbrella that Iran could extend would have a direct effect on Hezbollah's behavior when it comes to dealing with Israel. So I would put Hezbollah and Iran as one interlinked threat, and easily, in my mind, the top priority threat that is facing the state of Israel when you look at the capabilities that these adversaries have developed.
And I take your point, and of course you've qualified it very, very carefully, which is you're a military analyst by expertise and by profession, and you're our in-house analyst here at the MirYam Institute, and you've expressed that the priority list that you have brought together, that is through a military lens. Where I would push back, and where I want people to look at when I say that the Israel-Palestinian conflict is actually the highest order strategic challenge to the state of Israel, is that one, of course, cannot assess strategic challenges purely through a military lens. It doesn't tell the full picture. A military solution will not bring about a political solution in many, many conflagrations, not just here in Israel, but around the world. One has to look at the diplomatic implications. One has to look at the implications of international relations. One has to look at the implications upon alliances, even long-standing alliances. And when one thinks about Hezbollah, one would be hard-pressed to consider that a key ally of the State of Israel, the United States of America, Great Britain, France, whomever, would come forward and express their support for Hezbollah's bombardment of the State of Israel pretty much in its entirety, at least the capacity and the ability to do that. Obviously, Israel will respond. Obviously, Israel will overcome, in my belief and in my assessment, but nobody's going to come along and be the cheerleader of Hezbollah's launch against innocent civilians and infrastructure in the states of Israel. I'm not sure that's the case at all when it comes to advocating or excusing or apologizing for the horrendous activities undertaken by Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria and in the Gaza Strip. I'm not sure that the almost de rigueur statements that we hear, such as Israel has a right to defend herself, which, by the way, is probably the wettest, most watered down statement that any ally of the State of Israel could make. Obviously, the State of Israel has a right to defend herself. I don't think we need anybody to affirm that for us. But I'm not sure that those statements will be de rigueur. I'm hearing people speak with ever-increasing freedom about the idea, for example, that military aid to the states of Israel should be conditioned upon Israel's treatment of the Palestinian Arabs, Israel's activities in Judea and Samaria, Israel's activities with regard to the Gaza Strip. In fact, Vivek Ramaswamy, who is currently vying for the nomination of the Republican Party. I don't think that he's going to gain that nomination, but he's a young up-and-coming presence within the Republican Party, gaining some traction in the polls, obviously a far cry from the front-runner Donald Trump, and obviously a far cry from the second Ron DeSantis. But here you have a young voice in the Republican Party who is saying and expressing quite clearly that he doesn't think that military aid to the state of Israel ought to be axiomatic. He doesn't think that it's necessary. He doesn't think that it should be presumed to be forthcoming. And you have this, of course, on the left, needless to say. You have it with Pete Buttigieg, who said the same thing. He was running for the Democrat nomination.
Yep.
And you have it from Beto O'Rourke, another individual who was running for the nomination. You have it from Elizabeth Warren, who's a much more mainstream politician there on the Democrat side of the aisle. And of course, Bernie Sanders, who in my opinion is a self-loathing Jew. But this is growing, Yaakov. And so for anybody to say that we can downplay the threat because militarily it's not the most pressing order, I think is looking at it, dare I say, and I don't mean this to you, I wouldn't dream of suggesting this about you, because I know the wide lens that you apply to these issues, but anybody who rests on the idea that militarily we have to assign order to these threats, I think is guilty of some level of myopia. I think we have a real ticking diplomatic threat here by failing to resolve this Israel-Palestinian conflict. And actually that brings us very, very nicely. You could feel free to respond, but because we're trying to run this being a bit more adherent to a time limit, that brings us very, very nicely to the second topic that we're going to discuss, which is the mooted normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, to be brokered by the United States of America, because that is the grist right now, Yaakov, for the rumor mill. This much discussed US brokered Saudi-Israel normalization that may soon take place. Now, back in March, Yaakov, just to give a little bit further context, I personally interviewed Yossi Cohen, who is the immediate past head of the Mossad, and he was deeply, deeply engaged, as you know, in the brokering of the Abraham Accords. He was something of a lead diplomat in that effort. You'll remember that at that time, Foreign Minister was Gabi Ashkenazi, former Chief of the General Staff, and Benny Gantz was in a rotation with Prime Minister Netanyahu at that time, an ill-fated rotation that never actually came to pass. And Yossi Cohen was basically the point person for the negotiations of the Abraham Accords and the give and take. And I asked him about the prospects in March when I interviewed him of the Saudis joining the list of Abraham Accords signatories. And he was absolutely categorical that such an event can happen and is very likely to happen soon. And I can't remember, to our listeners I'm saying this, I can't remember if that was during the recorded interview or during the additional 2 non-recorded interviews that I conducted with him at that same time frame. But I'll put a link to the recorded interview in the show notes to this podcast, which you can listen to as and when the fancy takes you. But in your brief, Yaakov, you wrote that on August 14th, Saudi Arabia announced that it had appointed its ambassador to Jordan, Naif bin Bandar al-Sudari, as non-resident ambassador to the State of Palestine and consul general in Jerusalem. The Saudi moves, you go on to say, seek to protect the kingdom's legitimacy both domestically and in the Arab world. It sends a message that it has not forgotten about the Palestinian issue as it moves forward with a process aimed at normalizing ties with Israel and gaining security guarantees, advanced weapons, and a civil nuclear program from the United States. Just to quote your article even further, you go on to write that the Saudi appointment can be seen as a signal to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu because it is telling him that any normalization agreement will require significant concessions from Israel regarding the Palestinians, such as, and I want everybody to listen very, very carefully to this list of demands rumored at this stage, but may likely be ratified in reality, such as a commitment not to annex, you say, I would say apply sovereignty over Area C of Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. That's condition number one. Condition number two, a halt to the construction of settlements deep within Area C, and possibly, worst of all, most egregious of all in my reading of this, possibly transferring parts of Area C to Palestinian Authority, as well as other steps designed to stabilize the PA's rule. Now, Yaakov, returning to what you wrote, you say that it's unclear what kind of impact such steps would have on the stability of Israel's ruling coalition, which includes nationalist religious elements, including the ministers I mentioned earlier, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who are ideologically opposed to the division of the land of Israel. But here I want to put this to you. I'm reasonably confident that I'm again a minority view on the issue of Saudi-Israel normalization, because I am not, Yaakov, I am not particularly excited about this prospect, and I'm particularly lukewarm about it because it is eminently clear to me that in the pursuit of state-to-state normalization, Israel is willing to submit itself to the most abnormal of demands. According to reports, the Saudis here claim for normalization to take place that Israel must preserve the conditions needed to bring about a two-state solution. And simultaneously, Yaakov, they're taking a wrecking ball, a sledgehammer, to a basic tenet of the two-state solution, namely that Israel controls Area C, the very same area they think Israel might like to just casually transfer back to Palestinian rule. So, Yaakov, in our panting pursuit of new friends, we seem far too ready to open the door to policies that harm our own flesh and blood, namely Israeli citizens living their lives in our ancestral homeland in Judea and Samaria. Tell me where I'm wrong.
Everything regarding Saudi normalization is a cost-benefit calculation. So when you look at it regionally, and when you look at the effect that it would have on the map of the Middle East, right? Right now, we can divide the Middle East between, let's call it red and blue, right? And red, let's say that's the Iranian axis, that's Iran and all of its proxies and partners and terrorist factions, and the Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and Iraq is essentially under Iranian control, and the Gaza Strip is a partner of this axis. Okay, I view it as one sort of network of adversaries that's operating against us. And on the blue side is Israel, the Abraham Accord states, and unofficially, it's not yet, hasn't officially joined the blue side, although it's obviously very much there, is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the crown jewel of the Middle East in terms of being an Arab power with the strongest economy, with a strong military capability, and with a powerful geostrategic weight that it can throw around the region. And if Saudi Arabia formalizes its relationship with Israel, I think that will be a complete game changer for the state of Israel, both because at the military level, that will create a new front, a new bloc that will be used to contain Iran in a way that's far more out in the open and effective than what's being done now, and whether that includes pooling together radar and air defense systems against Iran's missile and drone capabilities, intelligence sharing. A lot of this is done also through the United States. So there's a whole new ability for Israel and the Sunni bloc to enter this, we can call it a long-term competition, but competition is a misleading word because it's really a struggle over the future and the fate of the Middle East. Is it going to be dominated by this radical Islamist and dark vision, or are forces that are interested in stability and prosperity and a bright future, will they prevail? And if Saudi Arabia and Israel are able to enter into a formal agreement and to establish relations and pool their resources together, that will be a huge step in my mind towards the brighter vision for this region, and a real blow. I think there's a reason why the Iranian leadership is very, very frightened of this development, because it will represent a real blow to its attempt to cower the Sunni states, intimidate them, and to dismantle Israel's influence in the region as it encircles it with its proxies. So that's the sort of big view. Now, everything to do with the Palestinian issue and the Saudis, I view it as a kind of sort of legitimacy face-saving measure by the Saudis. I don't think the Saudis are particularly interested in or care very much about the Palestinian issue, but they feel that they have to take steps to show that they do have a minimal level of engagement in this issue, because they are, if they do normalize relations with Israel, they're going to have to explain that step to the conservative elements within the Saudi kingdom and to other forces in the Middle East that are not quite on board when it comes to normalizing with Israel, compared to, say, the Saudi leadership and Mohammed bin Salman, who is the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. So they need to take care of their legitimacy. By the way, I also wanted to add, this is a separate issue, but very important. In addition to all of the military and geostrategic benefits, the economic benefits of merging, Saudi investment power with, say, Israeli tech and other kinds of power is phenomenal. The potential there is absolutely phenomenal. And that's one of the reasons why I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he first came to power, said that Saudi normalization is one of his top strategic goals. He said that in his opening speech, and I think he's very much on the mark when it comes to that. And there's a reason why he made that such a top priority. So the Palestinian issue is, for the Saudis, a way to ensure their legitimacy as they maneuver closer and closer to normalization with Israel. Now, I think that in terms of realpolitik and security interests, there's an opportunity here for Israel to harness Saudi power, both in terms of legitimacy and possibly economic power, Saudi's extensive economic resources, to actually harness some of these resources into the West Bank, and where they could counteract some of the money that Iran is injecting into the arena. And if the Saudis and the Palestinian Authority, whoever runs the Palestinian Authority at this stage, it may not be Mahmoud Abbas, can get onto the same page, that could actually serve Israel's long-term strategic and security interests. The Saudis could be a real force for good. They could help stabilize the Palestinian Authority, which is an Israeli security interest, according to the IDF and Israel's own intelligence agencies. And they could help beat back Iranian and Hamas influence. And that's a big question mark. We don't know if that would happen or not. It may not happen. But certainly there's a lot to explore here. And I don't think that we need to look at it as an either or situation. There's a lot of statements being, thrown out into the air. A lot of these are designed, I think, again, to protect the legitimacy of the Saudis and others that are involved. Let's not forget also that when the UAE came on board the Abraham Accords, one of its conditions was for the Israeli government to stop plans to annex areas of parts of Area C. And the Israeli government complied under Prime Minister Netanyahu, because it made the calculation that this was more of a strategic benefit than proceeding with those plans. So I think, there's a complex set of cost-benefit analysis here. And if you have a steady hand that's aware of what Israel's core security interests are, its red lines, then I think it's possible to walk down this avenue and to gain tremendous benefits if it's managed correctly.
Well, I appreciate everything that you've just said there. And actually, the record shows clearly that Israel will comply to diktats from countries that seek to normalize relationships with it. I was alluding to Israel's compliance with the diktat of the UAE to halt and, in fact, move away from entirely the application of sovereignty, the planned application of sovereignty over the Jordan Valley. And here you have again another country, which incidentally gains a great deal of out of normalization with Israel, would gain a great deal from normalization with Israel, first preempting any such measures with a series of diktats. And to me, it's completely bizarre. It's completely bizarre that when it comes to war, the states of Israel will operate by a doctrine that pushes out as far as possible out of its territory enemy forces and will push IDF forces deep into the enemy's terrain. It's very, very strange to me that the states of Israel, when it comes to military attacks against it, will say, do not come here, do not enter here. If you do, there will be consequences. But yet, if a country asks us really, really nicely to give away land or preserve the conditions for giving away land, we will turn around time and time again and say, okay, let's do it. I mean, you mentioned the Saudis were the crown jewel in the dynamic of normalization, but the crown jewel in the states of Israel is Jerusalem. And it's a united Jerusalem, and it's a unified Jerusalem. It's a Jerusalem that was hard fought for, won on the blood of brave soldiers who sacrificed everything in the pursuit of the manifestation of our long-held fantasy and sustenance when we were scattered throughout the globe, namely returning to Jerusalem. And the idea that we would not immediately bat away these Saudi demands, emphasizing our legitimacy in exactly the same way that you are saying the Saudis are seeking to protect their own legitimacy, giving lip service, essentially, I think is what you're saying, to the Palestinian Arab cause, so that they can legitimately normalize relations with Israel, or at the very least continue the conversations to normalize relations with Israel. I wonder where our leaders are, who will emphasize our legitimacy, who will say, no, just a moment, we are a legitimate presence in Judea and Samaria. We are a legitimate presence in Jerusalem. We are the legitimate custodians of a unified Jerusalem. And Saudi Arabia, please understand that while we recognize all of the benefits that have just been expressed by Yaakov Lapin, you can get all of those without trying to impose upon us your little diktats about what we should or should not be doing within our own borders. I don't think Israel is doing the same. I don't think Israel, for example, is telling the Saudis that they must preserve the conditions, for example, for a rapprochement with Yemen, as an example. I don't think Israel would dream of doing so.
Israel isn't doing it, but the United States is. I'll just remind everybody that this is a three-way agreement. The Saudis, essentially what they want out of normalization more than anything else are the demands that they're making from the United States, which you read out. It's a civil nuclear program with the ability actually to use that as a threat against Iran by turning it into a military program. Sorry?
Terrible idea. Yeah, carry on.
and a U.S. military commitment, and the sale of top tier weapons, F-35s, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the main things that the Saudis are going after in this agreement. I mean, of course, they're very interested in moving closer to Israel, but certainly the Americans are saying, look, if this goes ahead, you are going to commit to ending your war in Yemen. So everybody's making demands. And, I just think this is the nature of the region. Everything is a negotiation. And the fact that demands are made does not mean that they will all be met. I just think this is how the real politics sort of bargaining, horse trading goes in the region. As far as Jerusalem...
Just to interject for a moment.
Yeah.
Okay. The previous demand was met. There was an open demand by the ambassador of the UAE in an opinion piece that I believe he published in the Washington Post, if memory serves, where he expressed, in order for normalization to come about, you're going to have to halt this initiative of applying sovereignty over the Jordan Valley. And that demand was met. Now, it was met for the reasons that you said. It was met because Prime Minister Netanyahu gamed this out, and he decided this is strategically of greater importance to Israel, this normalization, than the plan to apply sovereignty, except it merely marks the starting point for the next negotiation. And piece by piece, now we have this conversation about Israel withdrawing from Area C. What a completely bizarre development. And by the way, I know that the Americans are saying what they want of the Saudis, but I do not understand why the Saudis should be able to say what they want of Israel, and the Israelis are not able to say what they want of the Saudis, namely to drop these ridiculous terms and conditions.
They can't. Anybody can say anything they want, especially behind closed doors.
Why don't we? Why don't we try that?
First of all, in terms of what's happening behind closed doors, I will just say, let's be humble. We don't know what Israel's response to some of these demands have been. We also in Israel have not internally decided what our interests are in the West Bank. This is a debate that's happening within the state of Israel. There are some who claim that these are Israeli interests, and some like you who claim that these are terrible decisions for Israel to make. We haven't, inside Israel, come to a strategic decision about the West Bank. So maybe we should focus our efforts on that first in terms of that arena, internally figuring out what a consensus could look like without tearing the country apart, because so far we haven't done it. We've just sort of let the status quo go on. And again, I think, in terms of what the Saudis are saying, they are...
By the way, I strongly agree with that point. That was the point that I made in our first topic of conversation for today, that I believe affixing a policy for what we are going to do with the Palestinian arena, I believe that's our highest strategic priority in Israel. I don't think it's thought of as being, but that's my belief. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please carry on.
That's okay. And I wouldn't disagree in terms of the long-term strategy, because ultimately it's going to help define Israel's identity. I think that's where the Palestinian arena is most important. Israel's identity, the future of Israel, is going to largely be defined by the decisions it makes regarding the West Bank. And that's why I think the Palestinian arena is strategically vital. But militarily, I've already outlined my position. It's different. In terms of Jerusalem, the Saudis have not made any demands from Israel, as far as I know, except to keep the Temple Mount status quo as it is and to keep the Temple Mount quiet. I would also recommend that everybody checks out the piece that we have published by Major General in the Reserves, Eitan Dangot. He goes into great detail and he provides analysis unlike anywhere else that I've seen regarding what normalization could mean, both for Israel strategically and for Israel's internal political situation. And he spells out very clearly why this could actually challenge the very existence of the current coalition. So I would definitely recommend everybody read that paper. But, I think, again, the Saudis are very aware of what Israel's security interests are. And this is a very different Saudi Arabia than the one we had 20 years ago or 30 years ago. This is a Saudi Arabia that's extremely sympathetic to Israel's security needs, to Israel's security interests. I don't think they expect at any time for Israel to cease its military operations throughout the whole of the West Bank. I don't think they would expect that for a minute. Again, I think what they're doing is they're saving face. That's what they're trying to do, going for a minimal level of call it an arrangement or agreement that would enable them to move forward without facing attacks on their legitimacy. So I think that's the game that the Saudis are playing, and Israel has its own interests that it needs to protect and define. As we've said, it's a very complicated situation. And the fact that the Americans are involved as a third entity in this entire affair is also actually an opportunity for them to repair some of the damage that they have incurred as a superpower in the Middle East, because their entire status has been undermined by the perception of their allies. And that includes Israel, by the way. Israel and the Gulf Arab states have all been concerned by America's commitment or lack of commitment to the security architecture in the Middle East that they are supposed to be leading, to pushing back against Iran, to taking military action against Iran if that ever becomes necessary. And the fact that these doubts have emerged has severely weakened America's perception in the region. And this kind of arrangement would actually allow the United States to reaffirm itself as a major power broker in the region, as the superpower that shapes the region, and also push back against China, which has been making inroads in the region as well. So it's really a very, very complicated situation, which touches on everything from the very tactical to the macro strategic, and it's a fascinating scenario to examine.
Yeah, and it would be great to see the United States reassert itself here in the Middle East. It would be wonderful to see it come back as a major player, and it would be great to see it deter a rising Chinese presence here. And also when it comes to power brokering and diplomacy, we've seen, of course, the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that really raises another issue for me here with all of this. So I've spoken to you about my objections to these demands for, by the way, Yaakov, a central aspect of the two-state solution is the partition of Jerusalem. Nobody should be under any illusions about that. Even the Trump administration's Peace to Prosperity plan, which masquerades as being a tremendously pro-Israel plan, but I believe is probably the worst plan that's ever been put on the negotiating table. Even that calls for explicitly, under certain conditions and after certain circumstances come about, the partition of Jerusalem, with an area of East Jerusalem being the capital for the Palestinian Arabs, and they actually name it as being called Al-Quds in the document. For people who haven't read it, they should read it. So nobody's going to convince me that this phrase of preserving the conditions for the two-state solution does not touch upon the manipulation of Jerusalem. I simply don't accept that. I have no reason to accept it. Nobody else should accept it. But I've spoken about my objections to that, and I think I've made those sufficiently clear. But there's also a more macro concern that I have, and the more macro concern is this: the Saudis want advanced weaponry from the United States of America. Now, that will not, I don't believe, subsume Israel's congressionally guaranteed qualitative military edge, but I'm sure it will reduce the margin. So that's one challenge. Secondly, a civil nuclear program that is very likely to set off a series of copycat pretenders, including Egypt, including Turkey, including others. That should be of grave concern to Israel. And also, I just don't know how much stock I currently put in the idea of a limited security pact between the United States and, frankly, anybody in this region. Those are some areas of concern. But here's another dynamic that I'd like you to game out with me. I believe that the Iranian nuclear threat is going to be decided in the coming years, one way or the other. Now, a few years ago, I interviewed on Capitol Hill Yaakov Perry, who's the former head of the Shin Bet, of Israel's internal security forces. How would you describe the Shin Bet in English? The Internal Security
Domestic
Agency?
intelligence. I would call it domestic intelligence agency, although it's not purely domestic because, of course, it's extremely active in the West Bank. But It's essentially Israel's internal and local domestic agency, as opposed to the Mossad, which operates overseas.
Right. So Yaakov Perry was a former head of the Shin Bet, or the Shabak, as it's sometimes known. And I had him in conversation with Mike Morrell, who was a former acting director of the CIA, and both of them were of the view that Iran was going to gain a nuclear weapons capability. Now, this is a few years ago, and I'm of that opinion as well. I believe that unfortunately, I wish I wasn't of that opinion. I wish I could be compelled to see things differently. But I actually think Iran is likely to gain nuclear weapons capabilities. But let's assume that that's one scenario, and the other scenario is that it won't gain nuclear weapons capabilities, because the threat will be decisively and precisely nullified and eradicated. In either of those two scenarios, the countries with whom we are normalizing, the countries with which we are normalizing, always have the opportunity to do something that Israel does not have when it comes to Iran, which is to turn back toward them. Israel cannot do that. And in the case of the UAE, according to the agreement, though it's not actually been implemented yet in terms of all of the advanced weaponry that was agreed to, in the case of the UAE, firstly, they have begun to diplomatically interact with the Iranians. That's not a particularly recent development. This is something that's gone on. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, they have announced a rapprochement with Iran. And in both of their cases, they will be doing so armed to the teeth with advanced weapons. And if you add to that scenario an enduring complication of circumstances with the Palestinian Arabs and Israel's continued need to suppress terrorism through military operations, or a conflagration with Hezbollah that brings about a retaliation by Israel into Lebanon, you're going to see these normalizations stress tested. And you're going to see them stress tested in the face of countries that are better armed, have a better and stronger relationship with the United States of America, and who, in either of the two scenarios that I've described, have less of an incentive to preserve relations with Israel because the Iranian threat is either realized or dismissed.
So I would push back against some of the assumptions in the scenario that you presented. The first thing I would say is that everything that these countries are doing, and what every country in the region is doing that's not in the Iranian axis, is driven by interest. The Iranian axis is driven by ideology, and the Sunni Arab bloc is driven by interests, okay? And those interests have not changed and will not change, in my view, in the foreseeable future. And those interests are always going to be threatened by the Islamic Republic of Iran, its revisionist radical goal of exporting the Islamic Revolution, of taking over the Middle East, of bringing down any Arab regime that stands in the way, or intimidating it and cowering it into submission, of threatening the prosperity, the economic prosperity and stability of the region. It runs counter to every strategic clause and directive that has been formulated both publicly and behind closed doors by the leaderships of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and the other Arab powers of this region. And the fact that they have normalized is only, in my view, a result of the fact that they have lost faith in the willingness of the United States to protect them, to have their backs, to put it simply. And they're looking for some sort of de-escalation mechanism. And the Chinese provide that because the Chinese have this open line with Iran. So I don't think it's any coincidence that the Saudis enable the Chinese to come in and act as the mediators for reestablishing relations, because the next time that there's a crisis, the Saudis, will say, well, who are we going to call to try and stabilize the situation? We'll call the Chinese, and we'll pass messages on to the Iranians that way. But this is all really about keeping your friends close and your enemies closer. So Saudi Arabia very much views Iran as an enemy, and it's managing its conflict with Iran at this stage. Just as quickly as these normalization or restoration of relations agreements were reached, they can be undone. The next missile attack out of Yemen or out of Iraq or out of Iran itself, the next drone attack can change everything. This is a very quickly moving region, and it's in a very dynamic phase. And what was true today may not be true tomorrow, but the interests are not changing. And I think that the recognition by the Saudis, by the Emiratis, and the others, the Bahrainis, that Israel, a strong Israel, is very much in their interest as really the only regional presence that they can rely on to check the Iranians. Who is attacking Iranians other than Israel in Syria? In other places, according to international media reports, sabotaging the nuclear program, striking Iran's entrenchment program in Syria. The only country in the world that's doing that week in and week out is the state of Israel. And that's why behind closed doors, in my view, the Gulf Arab leadership looks to Israel as a shield to help push the Iranian threat back. If you want to know what the future of the Middle East should look like, as far as the Saudis are concerned, you can look you don't have to look any further than the 30-year program that the Saudis have published, in which they want to create enormous degrees of prosperity, diversify their economy, turn into a business hub. They're building a city on the Red Sea. They very much want Israeli technology to be a part of it. None of this fits in with the vision that the supreme leader Khamenei has for this region. And so this clash is going to continue. The only question is how it's managed and who is going to be, what role each side is going to play in long-term confrontation. So that's why I think that the assumption that the interests of the Saudis will change, I think is not correct. What might happen is that the Saudi leadership could change. And that, even though it's very unlikely, that's something that is we can't ignore that threat. And that's why this issue of qualitative military edge is so important, not because of the current Saudi leadership. If we could look into a crystal ball, and if we could know that the current Saudi leadership will never change, then QME will become a lot less important in my view. But because we don't have that crystal ball and we don't know who's going to be ruling these countries in the future, we have to have some kind of safety mechanism to make sure that even if there's a drastic change in leadership, that still will not create an acute and critical challenge, at least not immediate, to the security of the state of Israel. The last thing I would say about this is that we have to live in the real world. And what I mean by that when I say that is that if the United States doesn't help the Saudis build a civil nuclear program, the Saudis will find somebody else to do that. It's not like they can only go to the United States. They can go to China, they can go to Russia, they can go to others, and they can get help to build nuclear program sites. So if the United States is involved, that could actually give the Americans some leverage to controlling the program. So that's something to keep in mind, and it could be a reason to actually, give the green light to this program if it's under some sort of American and international supervision.
Yeah, and that's something that
Ambassador,
now Minister Ron Dermer, Minister of Strategic Affairs, actually expressed in a recent TV interview that I watched yesterday. I believe that it was published yesterday, that he emphasized the fact that the Saudis can go shopping for this civil nuclear program elsewhere. This is not the exclusive preserve of the Americans to bestow upon them or to sell to them. So I take your points about that. My point about this arming to the teeth of these countries is that it does reduce the depth, breadth, size, scope of Israel's qualitative military edge. I do not know that that is going to remain across a long enough timeline the resolve or the viewpoint of a preponderance of the US Congress that Israel needs to be in possession of a qualitative military edge. I don't know. We see things shifting there as well. I've said that earlier on in this program. We'll live and learn, but I think that the arming of these countries with these advanced weapons without knowing where these countries are going, I think that Israel has to watch that very, very, very carefully indeed. And I think Israel has to be very careful. I'm sure it will be very careful about what it agrees to and what it does not agree to for the sake of normalization, because normalization can be here one day and it can evaporate on a different day. And I'm always, for very, very different reasons, and then I'm actually going to jump onto the last point, Yaakov, because we're up against the clock.
Just before you do, I'll just say one thing.
I'm always reminded of the dynamic with Turkey, right? You remember how close, and they're not the only ones, but how close we were, the military training, the exchanges, and then comes one incident on the high seas and it's a total disaster.
Yeah, and was preceded by the rise of a Muslim Brotherhood figure to power. Absolutely, I take the point.
I'm sorry because I don't want to let this escape people's understanding. It really came to a head over what I'm describing here, which is I believe it was Operation Cast Lead. I think it was Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009. Erdogan's sitting there on the stage at Davos with Shimon Peres, storms off the stage, accuses Shimon Peres of being everything and anything, shows his true colors as an anti-Semite, incidentally, in subsequent years. This is what can happen. And it can happen.
And now he's trying to reverse that.
Back. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. You were going to make another quick point, and then I'm going to push us on to the last subject.
Arming the Sunni Arabs. So there's another way of looking at this, right? If we don't want to be the only ones who will, when push comes to shove, end up fighting the Iranians, and right now it's only us. There's nobody else doing it, right? The Saudis recently had the Chinese upgrade. Actually, they're now, for the first time, the Saudis are building ballistic missiles on Saudi soil, right? And beforehand, the Saudis got the Chinese in previous years to help upgrade their missiles. So the Saudis have a pretty extensive missile program that's underway. And I can assure you that those missiles are not aimed at Tel Aviv. They're aimed at Tehran. And I am going to make the argument that it's in Israel's interest for Saudi missiles to be pointed at Tehran. It's in Israel's interest to have more than one set of, let's call them warheads, pointed in Iran's direction. We want, just like we are surrounded by Iranian proxies and partners, and their warheads are coming at us from different directions, we want the Iranians to face multiple arenas too. And I think we need to keep that in mind. We had objections about the UAE getting F-35s. I'm not sure that we should object to the UAE getting F-35s, because the targets of those F-35s under UAE command would be Iran and its proxies. So that could be our interest. And I think we need to look at it from that perspective as well. So I'll stop there.
There's a lot more I'd like to say about it. I won't, because we've got to get to our last subject for only one reason. We're going to deal with it in very short order. So as I was saying, Yaakov, I've been pushing you and pressing you. I'm sorry, the internet just went down there for anyone who's been listening and notices a bit of a cat in the program, but we've recovered it for a few minutes at least. And I was in the midst of really lacing into you, Yaakov, for failing to bring us a good news story in your monthly brief, and you refuted my version of events, and I'm not convinced by your objections, but we'll carry on anyway. Look, there's a really great story. I just want to assign a couple of minutes to it, which is that the Israeli Ministry of Defense, German Federal Ministry of Defense, and Israel Aerospace Industries confirmed on August 17th that they will sign a record-breaking $3.5 billion defense agreement, Israel's largest ever defense deal, for the supply of the Arrow 3 Israeli air defense system to Germany. Yaakov, in just a couple of short minutes, tell us why this is wonderful news beyond the obvious.
Imagine trying to explain to people living 80 years ago that the Jewish state is going to be enabling the state of Germany to defend itself. It would have sounded like science fiction, and yet here we are. Boaz Levy, the CEO of IAI, during a conference call, mentioned how his mother was a Holocaust survivor, and why this is such a emotionally charged and powerful moment. It really speaks to how far the Jewish people have come since their darkest days, since our darkest days, to be able to be in the position to give Germany the ability to defend itself against, I might add, Russian missile threats. That's what this system is for. An interception system that's considered the best in its world. It intercepts ballistic missiles in space outside of Earth's atmosphere. And Germany's turning to Israel for this level of protection. I think that says it all.
And I think that that's a point very well made and seconded by our Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, whose mother, I believe, was the Holocaust survivor as well, if I'm not misremembering that.
I think so.
But he made the following statement. He said, quote, "The US government's approval of the delivery of the Arrow 3." And before everybody starts fulminating, because IAI has done this in partnership with a US company, the US has every right to withhold or grant approval, obviously. He said, to repeat it, "The US government's approval of the delivery is an expression of confidence in the outstanding capabilities of Israel's defense industries. This is a significant decision which will contribute to Israel's force build-up and economy." And he went on to say, "It is particularly meaningful to every Jewish person that Germany is acquiring Israeli defense capabilities." So, Yaakov, I thought you said it better than the defense minister, but he seconds your sentiment. And thank you very much for bringing about that wonderful, wonderful development, bringing it forward for our attention. And thank you for a great conversation. I'm sorry about the technical hitch. My internet went down momentarily, but we'll have this app live and we'll have it on the podcast. And I want to remind anybody who's listening to this podcast to please leave us a review. It really does help us to reach a wider audience. And Yaakov, it's great chatting to you, great conversing with you, and great having such a robust exchange with you once again. All the very best.
Likewise, Benjamin, it's always a pleasure. Always. Thank you very much.
Take care. Enjoy the new office.
Thank you.